time I hear that, it makes me nervous. Like, it gets me all wound up like I should be running on stage whenever we come out. But anyway, it's good to see you. Let's all relax. It's okay. The frantic music will stop now, and you can rest. For those who are new around North Shore, I'm Wolfgang. I'm one of the pastors here on staff, and very excited to have you here this weekend, especially on obviously a holiday weekend. And this, of course, having been Veterans Day yesterday. And so I know we have a lot of people at North Shore who have served in that incredible way. And so we honor them this weekend and say thanks for all you have done to serve us and be part of creating the kind of place, a nation where we can actually worship like this. So thank you for your willingness to serve and so on. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good thing. So thanks for that. Today I want to talk a little bit about, just begin by asking, I'm sure we've got some fishermen in the room, right? I did not grow up a big fisherman. My dad was an accountant in Pittsburgh, so we didn't do a lot of that sort of stuff. And the fishing that we did around our area was mostly bluegill. You know what a bluegill is? There's not a whole lot of good eating on a bluegill, right? So when I moved up here to the Northwest, I had a friend invite me to join him to go fishing shortly after we got here. And what an incredible experience. Those of you who've done this, the very first time I had a salmon on the hook, right? I mean, I thought I'd caught a whale, right? Because this thing's has a little more fight than a bluegill, let me assure you. And I remember just reeling that thing in slowly and finally pulling it in and thinking, this is the biggest fish that has ever been caught in the history of humanity, right? I felt very awesome in that moment. And of course, my friend's like, well, you can give that one back if you want. It's not actually a very good one. I'm like, no, I'm keeping it. What are you talking about, right? You got to be kidding me. Anyway, one of the things that you'll find when you spend any time around fishermen is they sometimes are known for their stories, right? In fact, sometimes they'll even try to outdo each other with, oh, this big one that I caught one time, or, oh, the one that got away. And let me tell you my story. Oh, you think that's impressive? Let me tell you my story. Well, I don't care what your story is. It does not hold a candle to the story that we're looking at through this series. Here's a taste. Jonah chapter 1, verse 17. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Of all the fish stories ever told, none compares to this. And last week, we kicked off a look at this little book in the Old Testament in a series we're calling Running from God. And we learned about the story of Jonah. And as Scott said last week, most people that know anything about the Bible, and specifically this story, they think the fish is actually kind of the most important character, certainly the most memorable of the entire book. But that's not true at all. The book, the core of this book, this very unique little book in the Old Testament, is this prophet Jonah. And he's one of my favorites. Because if you actually slow down for a moment and take a look at Jonah's life, at first it may not seem like we have much in common, but I have way more in common with Jonah than I wish I did. And I think there's lots we can learn. But sometimes what's hard for people is they get sort of bogged down in how to understand this story. They try to figure out, is there really such thing as a fish big enough to swallow a man? And how in the world did he survive inside that fish for a couple of days? Is this something we should read literally, like it happened as a historical matter? Is this more of a parable and something we're supposed to understand more metaphorically? There's lots of different ways that people understand this. And I'll admit it, it's a difficult story to believe on its face. In fact, maybe you heard the story about the little girl. She was sitting in science class, and her teacher was teaching about ocean mammals. She started talking about whales. And the teacher mentioned another famous fish story. She said, I know many of you are probably familiar with the story of Pinocchio, but there is no such thing as a whale able to open its mouth big enough to swallow a human being. And a little girl shot her hand right up in the class. And she said, well, what about Jonah? Jonah was swallowed by a whale. And the teacher said, well, honey, I understand, but there's all kinds of reasons why that couldn't have actually happened. And the little girl's indignant. She says, well, the Bible says Jonah was swallowed by a whale. And the teacher again explained, I understand, babe, honey, but that's impossible. And the little girl was getting a little frustrated by this point, and she said, well, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask Jonah myself, she said. And of course, the teacher was getting a little frustrated at this point too, and she asked, well, what if Jonah isn't in heaven? And the little girl said, well, then you can ask him. That's not nice, little girl. That's not nice. Anyway, I don't think it's imperative to your salvation how you interpret or understand this story, okay? And I'm not going to stand up here and pretend to understand all this works. And yet, I have to say, even if you're skeptical about giant fish and surviving underwater for 3 days, I want to give you the same challenge that Scott gave us last week when he kicked off this series. And he had a little more time that he dealt with this in a little more detail. So if you want to explore this a bit more, make sure you grab the app or the podcast, go back to last week and listen to that message that kicked us off. But here's the challenge that he gave us as we started this series. He said, whatever you make of this story, don't let the fish stump you, okay? And again, he talked about this at more length last week. Sincere, Jesus-loving people understand this story in different ways, okay? So we acknowledge that, and you go back and hear some more of his thoughts on that last week. But what I do want to do today, because of time, I'm going to keep going. What I do want to do today is ask you to at least be open, okay? Give me at least a maybe to this idea that God, the God of the Bible, is a God of miracles. I mean, this isn't the only one we read, of course, in this book. And I would go so far that this story of the great fish, it's actually not even the most unbelievable part of this story, the most miraculous thing, in my opinion. I think there are other things we find in this book that are even harder to believe, that fly in the face of how things are supposed to go. Things that don't make any sense at all based on what's normal in our world. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit together today in this message we're calling Hitting Rock Bottom. But before we dive in, let me give us a quick rewind on where we were last week. If some of you were here last week, you know we met one of the greatest runners of all times, and I'm not talking about Jesse Owens or Carl Lewis or even Usain Bolt. I'm talking about Jonah, this man famous for his running. Jonah is called by God to go to a city called Nineveh, which is the capital city of an empire called Assyria. And in a very deliberate act of disobedience, Jonah runs the opposite direction from God. And he boards a ship in a seaport called Joppa to run to a place called Tarshish, which is on the far western side of the Mediterranean Sea. So Nineveh is east and not all that far. Tarshish is west and very far away. This going to Tarshish for Jonah would be sort of like God saying, I want you to go to New York. And Jonah says, I don't think so. I'm going to Honolulu. Okay? It's a little bit of what this is like. And he gets on this boat hoping to escape from God, but God won't let him escape. He loves him way too much to let him run. And so God shows up in the fury of this storm. And the sailors, the other people on this boat, they of course freak out. They find out what Jonah has done, and this violent storm is somehow associated with choices he's been making. And so long story short, they throw him overboard, and this is where we find him. This is where we left him last week. He's sinking deep beneath the blue water somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea. And you've got to wonder, as Jonah's trying to keep his energy, trying to tread water, trying to stay above as the waves are crashing over his head, what is going through his mind at this point? I mean, he really thought he could outrun God. He gave it his best try. He deliberately disobeyed God. I mean, this wasn't one of those oops moments where, hey, I didn't realize, I'm so sorry. This was on purpose, okay? And the consequences of his behavior not only put himself in danger, but also the lives of other people in danger. Sin has a way of doing that sometimes in our lives, doesn't it? Anyway, you know right now as he's sinking there in the water, he has to be thinking as he's trying his best to stay afloat, feeling like a complete failure. As some prophet I am, right? He's running out of air. Maybe his lungs are beginning to burn from the fatigue. It's dark. He's desperate. He's getting tired. This is how Jonah ends, he thinks to himself. And if this was how Jonah ends, with him drowning in the sea, nobody would be surprised, right? I mean, that's how it works. That's how the system works. It's karma. I mean, you don't just ignore a direct command of God and get away with it. Everybody knows that. You break God's rules, you bring punishment on yourself. You bring judgment and wrath and all those different sorts of things. What do you think the consequences are for disobeying God? You think you could just do that and get away? Not only ignoring what he told you to do, but doing the exact opposite. When you do that, you deserve whatever you get. But here we see the first of the most unbelievable things about this book. I'd call this a miracle, even. Jonah deserves to sink into those waves and go down and drown. But what does God do? In an amazing act of grace, Jonah doesn't get what he deserves. God arranges for his rescue. Now, granted, his method is slightly unconventional, all right? I'll give you that one. God dials up Enterprise Rent-A-Fish, because they'll pick you up, which is nice. And in this unbelievable act of compassion and grace, God rescues Jonah even when he doesn't deserve it. You see, this is why I believe how God rescues Jonah isn't so much the miracle to me. It's that God rescues Jonah. It's that he doesn't just let him deal with the consequences of mistakes. Say, sorry, buddy, you had your shot, as many of us would be prone to do. Instead, this teaches us something about this God of second chances, who pulls these kinds of miraculous things off throughout human history. I mean, you talk about unfailing love. You talk about amazing grace. You talk about inexhaustible patience and mercy. You talk about pursuing someone. You talk about a miracle. The miracle is God rescued Jonah in the first place, not exactly how he chose to do it. That is the heart of God. That is the good news. That's what this place is all about, is that God is still in the rescue business, even when we don't deserve it. Even when what we've done is run the opposite way of what he would have us do. That is the heart of this church. It's the heart of our faith, because we believe it's the heart of our God. When it seems he's gone too far, when it seems like it's all over, God shows up. And Jonah recognizes this. And so the second chapter of this little 4-chapter book is a window into Jonah's mind. It's almost a little excerpt from his prayer journal. Jonah writes this little poem that's sort of the retelling of his own fish story. Because in that dark time, Jonah does a little reflecting on his life. He has a little time to pray now. And let me ask you, have you ever been alone in a dark, really dark season in your life when you've come face to face with who it is you're becoming, with the truth about yourself? I mean, those moments in your life can be defining moments, can't they? Jonah's having one of those defining moments. And so if you have a Bible, you can follow along. It'll also be on the screen behind me. It's Jonah chapter 2. And the first verse says, "From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God." Now, one more thing on this I want to say real quick. This is maybe a key lesson. Maybe this is the reason you're here today, is to hear this. No matter who you are or what you've done, you need to know it is never too late to pray to God. It's never too late. You're never so far gone that you can't reach out to him. Never run so far that you can't turn and call out his name. It's never too late to pray to God. So listen to what Jonah prays. Verse 2. He said, "In my distress," that's kind of an understatement, right? "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help." And in this extraordinary phrase, "You listened to my cry." You listened to my cry. Not, "And you said, too bad, so sad." Not, "You had your shot, Jonah. Too bad you didn't pray this back on the dock in Joppa. But now, sorry, brother, train's left the station. You had your chance. You should have obeyed. You're just getting what you deserve." He doesn't say any of those things, does he? He says, God listened to his cry. And it's here that we learn one of the most important lessons, not only in this story of Jonah, but in the broader scriptures themselves. It's this truth I don't want you to miss today. You can run from God, but you can't outrun God. I mean, you can run. You can try to get away. You can try to go your way. And yet, even when you choose to run away from God in your life, whether it's in big ways or small ways, you can try to run, but you can never outrun him. You can never get so far that he can't be reached or that he can't reach you. Even when it seems you've done too much, gone too far, you've never gone so far that God can't rescue you. You can run from God, but you can't outrun him. And I'm not just talking about in the big choices. I'm talking about in the little choices as well. I think that's one of the dangers as we study this book. Because as we read this story, we kind of think, okay, so note to self, if I ever hear the audible voice of God saying, pack up your stuff and go to some dangerous mission field, make sure you say yes. All right? Is that the takeaway from Jonah? See, the danger, if we think it is we'll think, well, until I hear some audible voice saying pack up and ship out, then I'm good. I'll just make sure I don't mess it up if that happens. I think the payoff, the lesson here, is far more subtle and far more daily. Because every day I have the choice whether or not to listen to what God is saying in my life, to what God's word is saying to my life. In the area of my marriage, how I respond as a husband, how I respond as a dad, how I respond as a coworker, as a member of the community, as a guy, as a human being, whatever the case may be. I have choices to make, or whether I will go God's direction or whether I will go my own direction. That's the far bigger danger, I think, for so many of us. It's not so much Nineveh or Tarshish. It's things like forgive or hold a grudge. It's things like be generous or be stingy and greedy. It's things like encourage instead of gossip. It's those subtle little moments every day, not just the big ones where we decide whether we'll go to Nineveh or not. It's whether we decide to listen to God's voice in our everyday lives. So you can run from God and still stay right where you are. It's just choosing to live your life your way instead of His. And Jonah learned in the darkest moments of his life, in his case when it came to a big decision, and he found himself facing serious consequences as a result. He describes what it felt like for him to hit rock bottom. And listen to this very vivid, colorful language. Verse 3. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. It's this incredibly vivid language. I was going down, he says. But it wasn't even the sailors that were really behind this, I see now. It was you, God. I see your hand calling me back, guiding my path. I see you at work, even in the hard things of my life. Go on, verse 4. Jonah says, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. This vivid image. Seaweed was wrapped around my head, right? It's like a sushi bar gone bad is what we have right there, right? Seaweed is wrapped around my head. And then he uses this rock bottom language here. Listen to this. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. That's low. The roots of the mountains. The earth beneath barred me in forever. The language is this idea of a cage trapping him. I mean, he is stuck. He is at rock bottom, the end of his rope, beyond hope, too dark, in too deep. Have you ever been there? Where you felt like you've just gone too far this time, right? I'm in too deep. I'm drowning here. I mean, how many of us could write a little poem similar to this one, telling our story? Because many of us in this room, we know what that feels like. The details might be different, but we know what it feels like to hit rock bottom, to find ourselves so low, so hopeless, so helpless, that we're not sure what to do. It feels like we're drowning. And as we're learning today about Jonah hitting rock bottom, I also want to introduce you to someone else who knows a little about hitting rock bottom in his life. His name's Adonis. And he didn't grow up here at North Shore. His first encounter with North Shore was through a counselor that he met as part of our support and recovery ministries just a few years ago. And yet he's a guy that knows what it feels like to hit rock bottom. And he very generously and graciously agreed to sit down with our video team to share a little of his story. Listen to Adonis' experience.
For most of my life that I've been running from God, I was trying to do life my way. Growing up, my dad was in the military. He was civil service at that point. My mom, stay-at-home mom. I didn't have very many friends growing up. My dad, when I was 9, passed away suddenly in a car accident. So that was shocking, 9 years old, and being told by by your church and by people from the church that, like you're the man of the house now, and, not really understanding what that meant. I felt like in conservative church, it was just more so about how you looked versus actually how you felt on the inside. So I learned to fake it. So around 11 or 12 is when I realized for myself that I was gonna struggle with same-sex attraction, and I was just mortified. I was like, no, this can't be my struggle. Like, I don't want this to be my issue. I just didn't think that, anyone would ever accept me for my struggles. And dealing with that pain and those things that I just hadn't dealt with, I turned to alcohols and drugs. I was done with the whole church thing. Like, I wanted to drink, I wanted to party, I wanted to just have fun. In October of 2013, I'd say it was when I really was on the verge of hitting like rock bottom. I was going to a rave in downtown Seattle for Halloween. I ended up overdosing that night. I was on the verge of killing myself, most literally. I ended up in the hospital, like woke up and I was just like, man, this is all I'm gonna do with my life, kind of a thing. Like, this is it. Like, I'm gonna be partying and drinking and gonna still hook up, I guess, and that's gonna be it for me.
So the details might be different, and the specifics may not be the same, but many of us, that sounds familiar, that experience of hitting rock bottom in hard and painful ways. Many of us in this room, again, there may be some different details, but many of us, we know what it feels like in one way or another to land hard like that. Nobody in this place is immune. And yet it's often in those moments that we actually wind up coming face to face with this powerful truth, the second thing I hope you'll take home with you today. And it's this: even when it's dark, God is at work in your life. Even when it's dark, even when it feels hopeless, even when you can't imagine how He might be at work, God is at work in your life. Even when we feel like we're drowning, even when we feel like we're in too deep, even when we feel like it's beyond hope, God is at work. He is with us. And let me just say very directly to those of you in this room right now who feel like you might be drowning, God has not abandoned you. He has not forgotten you. He has not written you off because you ran away. He has not said you've used up all your chances or your allotment of my grace. He pursues you. He has not let you to drown. And He is with you in the water. And He was with Adonis in that hospital, even if he couldn't see it. And He is working in even the darkest situations because He wants to throw you a lifeline, no matter how dark it might seem. And the challenge is to be honest, to get honest with God, like Jonah did, like others have done, and to cry out for help, the one who listens. Look at what David wrote in Psalm 69. He said it this way. He said, "Save me, O God, for the floodwaters are up to my neck. Deeper and deeper I sink into the mire. I can't find a foothold. I'm in deep water, and the floods overwhelm me." You just pray an honest prayer like that. Father, help me. I don't know what to do. I can't see beyond this darkness. Help me to trust that your hand is still there even if I can't see it. Help me to see that there is a bigger picture here and that you are with me and that you are there and your unfailing love can be trusted, that you will not abandon me. And sometimes the only way for us to really understand this grace, for us to really let it be more than just cliche or something we lip along to in a setting like this, the only way it drills deep, deep, deep into our hearts is to sometimes endure those hard times. Because even when we cry out in an honest prayer like that, the truth is we may still have to go through some really hard stuff because of our choices. I mean, Jonah certainly did. But sometimes it takes getting to that very bottom, to the very darkest place, to finally be able to see. I mean, would Jonah's life have been better if he had prayed something like this or obeyed God in the first place? Of course. Would he have been better off to have cried out to God on the dock before he boarded the ship? Or before the storm came in? or before he was thrown overboard? Would he have been better off at that point to cry out to God? Absolutely, of course. Why is it that Jonah waits until the very last minute when he's like one breath away from losing his life, from drowning? Why does he wait so long to cry out to God? It's because he's just like me. It's because he wants to do it his way. And he wants to hold on to that way. There's a stubbornness in me that makes me crazy sometimes. It's not just my kids, although I've given it to them too. See, here's what I've learned in my ministry and in my life, and you've maybe heard this said before. People don't change when they see the light. When do they change? They change when they feel the heat, right? When the pressure's on. When you have nothing left, when you're down to your last breath. It's often then that we're finally willing to admit, I can't do this on my own. Well, Jonah feels that heat. He's down to his last breath, probably. But it's that heat, that pressure, that desperation that opens his eyes. It helps him to see just how gracious this God is. Not just in some philosophical or theoretical sense, but in a real way. And it opens his eyes. You know, some people think that being swallowed by the great fish was God's way of punishing Jonah. Like this is some kind of episode of Scared Straight Ocean Edition or something like that, right? I don't think that's right. I think this is an act of grace. It's an act of rescue. I think God knew what it would take to get Jonah's attention. And sometimes God will allow us to go through these things just so we'll look up to Him. Let me be clear. I'm not saying every storm in life is God's way of getting our attention. I mean, sometimes there are just storms in life. Jesus Himself said, in this broken world, you will have trouble. It just goes with the territory in this broken place. But here's something I hope that you will remember. Sometimes when you go through storms like Jonah was enduring, don't miss this lesson. A third thing I hope you'll take away. God's not looking to pay you back. God's looking to bring you back. This isn't about revenge or wrath. This is about a calling, an invitation. Come back. Come back. He graciously allows the heat to rise so that we'll look to Him, so that we'll cry out to Him. And that's exactly what Jonah does. Second half of verse 6. Take a look what he says. He says, "But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit." Because when you're at the bottom of a pit, there is nowhere else to look, right? But up. Sometimes that's what it takes. Verse 7, "When my life was ebbing away," he's almost out of breath, "I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them," he says. An idol, of course, is anything else that we put before God. It could be anything else that we look to try to rescue us or to try to help us escape the pain of life. The things we think will take care of us, but ultimately never can. When we turn to those other things, when we depend on something that's worthless, we miss out on the love that God has for us, the blessing, the joy that comes from walking with Him, coming to know that He can be trusted, and that He sees us not through the lens of our mistakes and our struggles, but as something new, with a new start. Sometimes it takes a fish to see that. Look at what he says in verse 9. "But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord." I see now, God. I see your goodness. I see your grace. And all I can say is thank you. Thank you. But it all begins with that critical moment of crying out to God. No matter who you are, what we're doing, what we've done. When you're at the bottom of the pit with nowhere to look but up, God steps in. And it's never too late. You need to know that today. And just as God used hitting rock bottom to reach Jonah, God did the same thing in the life of Adonis. He began this process of rebuilding that brought him to North Shore, where he met Jeff Simons, who's one of the leaders, one of the counselors in our support and recovery ministry. Listen to the next leg of Adonis' story.
May 17th of 2014 is when an experience with God, he got a hold of me on the way to a Sounders game. I'd been drinking most of that day, and me and my friends were walking in downtown Seattle towards the stadium to go see this game. And God chose that moment to really speak through that drunkenness and basically posing the question to me of a choice of, do you still want to go down this road kind of a thing? Because you can, and I just won't be with you anymore. Or you can choose me and start the process of actually coming back to God and actually, repairing what is broken in my life. And in that moment, it kind of all finally clicked in my mind of like, yeah, I don't have to be doing this stuff anymore. Like, I never wanted to be doing this stuff in the first place. It was a Saturday night. Still know the time, 7:17, is when I realized I'm not going to drink anymore. I'm not going to, this isn't going to be my life anymore. And I also thought that, well, since I'm free of this, that must mean that the same-sex attraction piece, as I was acting out on it only when I was drinking and things like that, so this is going to go away too. Yeah, that was definitely not the case, because it was definitely a lot more work to be done. I think it was October 20th of 2014 is when I actually had my first sit-down thing with Jeff Simons, and throughout that process of just getting healing, it's definitely hard. There was ups and downs for sure. There were times where I would just think that, man, this process is stupid kind of a thing. This isn't working. Talking about this isn't helping me. I still feel the same, but at the same time, I knew that there was something different because things inside of me were changing. It's just such an amazing feeling of just knowing that there is true peace in following God. That peace that the Bible talks about that passes all understanding in Philippians 4:7. That's something that we can all experience, versus thinking that my homosexuality or my gay feelings and those things that I felt were driving me before, that relationship with God now, that takes precedent on who I am and what God sees in me. He sees me as his child, and I'm beloved, and I am I am worth more than what I ever thought that I could be worth.
It's an incredible moment when you come to realize I am worth more than I ever imagined I could be worth. I am loved more than I ever imagined I can be loved. And this God, he doesn't see me just for my struggles, for my past, for my issues, for my mistakes, for whatever. He sees me in my distress, and he hears me when I cry. And he says, I want to help. I want to help. To find a place of peace, as Adonis described it, that defies his description. And sometimes it takes going through that darkness to begin to realize what the light even looks like. So that's Adonis's fish story, you might say. And he could sit down probably and write something similar to what we find Jonah writing there in chapter 2, this account of what it felt like at rock bottom in those worst moments, but what it looked like to finally turn and say, God, I need help. And he would tell you, I can tell you, many of us could tell you, from that moment on is not always smooth sailing. It's not always just easy up and to the right. Everything's better right away. Sometimes there's struggle. Often there's challenge. It's painful and anything but smooth. And yet, when we see ourselves as God sees us, as worth rescuing, as loved and worth it, that gives us a whole new perspective. When we're reminded that we're not alone, that he's reaching out to us. I mean, sometimes the only way to get there is to actually hit rock bottom. Another prophet in the Old Testament, a guy named Jeremiah, he wrote it this way in the book of Lamentations. He said, "They threw me into a pit and dropped stones on me. The water rose over my head, and I cried out, 'This is the end.' But I called on your name, Lord, from deep within the pit. You heard me when I cried. Listen to my pleading. Hear my cry for help. Yes, you came when I called, and you told me," here's the lesson, "do not fear." You don't have to be afraid. You've not gone so far, because it's there that you learn these important lessons. You learn, first, that you can try to run, but you will never outrun this God. And to learn lesson 2, even when all I can see is darkness, He is still working and calling you home. And then third, that when we go through some of the painful things that are associated with decisions that we make, it's not about God trying to pay us back. It's about God trying to bring us back. I see that now, God. I see it, and I thank you. And I don't know if I would have ever gotten there if I hadn't hit rock bottom. Because it's only there that you learn beyond any other environment this beautiful truth. God's grace is always greater than your mistake. God's patience is always greater than your running. And that's the good news, friends. That's many of our stories. It's my story. So many stories of people in this room. Our lives were transformed by this Jesus, who kind of like Jonah was sent from his home to a faraway place to bring light into a very dark environment, to bring hope to a very lost people. But instead of refusing like Jonah did, instead, Jesus embraced this mission. He agreed to do it. And He came, and He taught, and He healed. And even though He said yes to God's call, He still found Himself going through some deep darkness. You'll remember the cross, of course, death itself. And He spent 3 days, the Bible says, in that tomb. In fact, Jesus even compares it to Jonah's experience. But of course, just like Jonah didn't stay in that fish, Jesus didn't stay in that tomb. He erupted with a renewed awareness, a renewed example of what it looks like to be fueled by the power of God. From that dark place to bring hope and life. That is our hope. And I can't help but wonder if there are some here today. Today needs to be that moment when you cry out. Nobody else knows how deep and dark it feels right now. But maybe this is that day when you cry out. And you say, Lord, I don't know what this is going to involve. It could get messy. I mean, after all, Jonah's vomited up onto the beach in the story. It's messy. It could get messy, Lord. But I'm ready to cry out to you. Because I'm sick of this seaweed wrapped around my head. I'm sick of this burning feeling in my lungs, wondering if I can hold on for another moment. I need you, God. And maybe this is that day for you. Last hour, we wrapped up this message with someone being baptized. This beautiful image of them coming to the point of saying, God, I'm ready to follow you. I've tried it my way. I'm ready to walk with you. And maybe you need to make that decision today too. And if you do, I'd love nothing more than after the service, I'll be over here in the corner. I'd love to talk to you about that. Pray with you about that. Help you as you cry out to God in that moment. But for the rest of us, who know Jesus, who daily are being called to make choices, not the big ones always like Nineveh or Tarshish, but little ones every day, will you respond to His call? What's your story? What's your story? Would you just bow your head with me? Let's pray together. Oh God, your patience, your grace, it is overwhelming. And it's one thing to sing about in songs or to hear people talk about in their lives, but when we find ourselves in a deep, dark place, and when we have firsthand experience then of reaching out to you and seeing you rescue us, even if it's hard, even if the story is still being written, that changes from something that we believe theoretically to something that's at the center of our lives. And as one who's found that and learned that lesson the hard way, God, I thank you. Just as Jonah said, I thank you. I'll sacrifice everything. It's all yours, Lord. Salvation is in the Lord alone. And yet, Lord, for those in this room who right now are in that dark place, who whether it's their choices or just the circumstances of life, find themselves in a place where they don't know what to do, where they're drowning and they don't think they can hold on. They can't keep that marriage going. They can't handle their kids anymore. They don't know financially how they're going to survive. They don't know spiritually where to look for hope or help. Whatever it may be, God, I pray that this will be the day that they cry out to you. That they ask that you will step in, Lord, and bring the healing and the rescue only you can. This could be a huge day. Just like Adonis remembered those dates in his life. This could be a huge day. So, Lord, for those in that place, God, will you rescue them? Will you hear their cry? So many stories of you doing this in people's lives. We simply ask that you'll do it again. Rescue again. Bring new life again. Show yourself powerful and miraculous again. Do it again, God. We sing and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.